In today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast, we are joined by Omari Sankofa of the Detroit Free Press to discuss whether the Detroit Pistons should get a new starting lineup, how can they help Cade, and what to think about the Pistons as the trade deadline continues to get closer. We'll talk about all that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Ku Khahil. You can find me over on Twitter at Ku Khahil. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free to available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Also, I want to let you guys know to head over to LockedOnDaily.com. You can see it in the bottom right of the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. Head over there, type in your email, and you'll get a Locked On Pistons daily newsletter going along with your Locked On Pistons daily podcast. I've heard a lot of feedback. A lot of you guys have really enjoyed it, so if you haven't checked it out already, make sure you guys go over there and check it out. But we are joined today by Omari Sankofa, Detroit Free Press beat writer for the Detroit Pistons. Omari, I appreciate you coming on, man. We'll try to keep the introduction short and sweet and get right into this and get you out of here as quick as possible. We are recording this on Saturday, so this will be posted on Monday. So the Pistons play tonight. We won't be, when the Monday episode rolls out, you won't have a recap of that game yet. So stay tuned for Tuesday. Just want to give you guys a quick heads up on that. But Omari, let's get into it. The Pistons starting lineup it's been about around 24, 25 games. They've played 188 minutes. Cade Cunningham, Jane Ivey, Tim Hardaway Jr., Tobias Harris, and Jalen Duren is the starting five. And through these 25 games, 24 games, it's been a quarter of the season, roughly, a little bit over a quarter of the season. They have a net rating of minus 6.98, an offensive rating of 116.8, defensive rating 123.7. I probably should have done that in reverse, but my fault. All right. So it's been about a quarter of the season. Do you think we've seen enough to think the starting lineup needs to change?
I think we're getting close to that point. I think the issue, to the extent that I said the issue this earlier this season, is that starting group did find momentum early, and I think so there's two things going right. There's one that they did find some momentum after that 0-4 start, and then two, you have some veteran guys, and THJ and Tobias, and you know what they could do. One, Tobias has a shot at the three super well to start the season. That's begun to pick up over the last week, and I think that's the one thing as a coach you decide is how long do you give a veteran guy time to really get back into a rhythm, right? You run a new team and whatnot. And then two, THJ was shooting like 47% from three, before he had that head injury and hasn't quite been as good since he came back. So I think same thing there, right? I think any coach wants to give a lineup enough time to gel before you start making more drastic decisions. But you look at the team now, they're fully healthy. You have a Star Thompson back, which is huge. And the more he plays, the less his minutes will be restricted. And they've dropped 5 of their last 7 or something like that. So you're probably getting to the point where you start to look at more long-term changes if it looks like this current group you have is not getting it done. Because as you mentioned, just through the last few weeks, they haven't really been quite where you want them to be.
So I think everyone's immediate thoughts, let's just get it out the way. I think everyone's immediate thoughts goes to the 5 position. I don't think
Mhm.
anyone's really thinking that Tobias is going to get benched.
Yeah,
I think, and Tobias, like you said, he's been picking it up lately, and I don't think anyone
yeah.
really thinks he should be getting benched. THJ, once Asar gets his minutes back to full time, we'll see if that's something that could happen. I know there's some people that think maybe Malik Beasley should take over that spot. I guess this is a discussion, but I wouldn't because Malik's been so good in his role off the bench. I don't know if I'd want to disrupt that. But I think the real discussion that a lot of people are having is the 5 position. Jalen
Mhm.
Duren. Look, I think Jalen Duren has not had the best season. I think Jalen Duren has not made the necessary steps defensively that you necessarily would have liked to see from him. I think you've seen more flashes as an interior defender from him this year, but him in space has still not been very good. Him against centers with ball skills haven't been very good. Him against centers that can space the floor out, 5 out, rotations, it just hasn't been that great. And I think I'll throw it back to you just to give this backdrop real quick. I think what's really making it such a loud discussion is because the backup is making an immediate difference when he comes into the game. If Stu was coming into the game and it wasn't that drastic of a difference, I don't think anyone really would be pressing about the Jalen Duren starting. But like I said, if you look at that starting lineup, Pistons currently have a minus 6.98 rating. If all you do is take Jalen Duren out, you put in Isaiah Stewart, and that net rating jumps to plus 9.9. So it's like that's a what is that 17-point on off differential. So like that's I think that's what's causing the conversation. Do you think there should be do you think it's legit to have that discussion? Do you think the Pistons should be looking to maybe start Stu instead of Durant?
I think it's a legit conversation. I mean, you just laid it out in the numbers right there. And, I think that matches the eye test even, right? Every time Isaiah Stewart checks in, it just seems like this team picks up its defensive verve. It plays with more of an identity. I think he has a physicality and an execution to his game that kind of elevates everybody else. The energy he comes in with. And I think that's been more pronounced this season than it's been in years past, just because Stu's been in that primary role. You're not playing him next to Duran for I forget what it was last season, but it was I think over half of his minutes were being played with Jalen Duren. So that's just an entirely different role. We really haven't seen him this type of way, I think, since his rookie year. And you kind of look at how the block numbers and everything else have correlated, and even though he can move his feet, I think it's pretty clear at this point that he's a much better defender at the rim, and he is the best rim protector on this team. So I think that's a discussion you have to have and you have to consider. And I think when you're a team like the Pistons, you're 9-15, you're still in the play-in hunt. You're generating some positive headlines for the first time, but at the same time, you still need to move this needle forward, right? And you have to find that balance between development and also just setting a standard and getting results immediately. And obviously, when you have guys like Tobias and THJ, those vets are going to start. I think in most instances on a team like this, but Isaiah is just not getting to the point to where he's a vet, right? Like he's a year 5 on his new deal. So I guess I wonder if there's a point where eventually he kind of gets that benefit of the doubt of he's performing at a higher level. Obviously we need to develop Duran and give him opportunities, but there's probably a dial you could shift there and still accomplish both of those goals while winning.
Do you think that there's another position? We obviously, like I mentioned, 5 positions where a lot of people are going immediately to. But do you think there's another part in the starting lineup that you could see JB Bickerstaff making a change to?
Yeah, I think beyond that, and you kind of mentioned Malik Beasley, who, like he's having the best start of any Pistons shooter ever. So that's something you look at. This is less like I don't know if you can fix this with the actual roster. And this is probably something you want to get into later, but there's just not enough playmaking really in any lineup for this team, whether it's the starting 5 or bench. And that's not necessarily an indictment on Jaden Ivey as much as it is the rest of the roster, but he hasn't quite been that playmaker yet. And when you're seeing Cade, be over leveraged in certain situations over and over, that probably sparks a broader discussion on how you take that load off of his plate, right? And that's probably not uh, a question for this roster to solve unless you see guys like Ivy and Asar, step into that role and seize more of that playmaking. But that's probably more of a broader conversation on how you build the right roster around Cade, right? And if you don't have uh, what he needs around him, then obviously the next step is figuring out how you acquire that. So that's a broader discussion. But if you're looking at something this team needs, I think it's playmaking.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that later. I
Yeah.
think that I think that we're only 24 games through the season, but like you mentioned, when you see the issues with the roster or you see what's holding them back from, you see those sparks, you see those flashes, and you see this positivity, you see them go on some win streaks, you see them, one game away from 500, get some good wins, and then you see them struggle like this. You see the issue with the roster. It's no way to avoid like you mentioned the broader discussion of like, okay, we see what we see these flashes. How do you get to the next point? And like you mentioned, the only way really to get there, I think, right now, is by discussing outside the roster or outside the roster solutions. Before we move on, though, I do want to say you mentioned that they don't have a lot of playmaking in the lineups, and that's 100% correct. I think that part right there, I mentioned this on the last podcast with Czar. I think that part right there is probably one of the other bigger indictments of Jalen Duren so far this year. Is that you expect? JB talked about this in the offseason, and we've seen Jalen Duren do this throughout his career. And one of the main reasons why people were so high on Duren is because of his playmaking ability, his ball handling ability from the elbow, his ability to run DHOs, to kind of be, I guess the expectation was to be kind of like a Bam type from the DHO perspective. You can be like a hub from the high post. And he just hasn't been that. And despite seeing JB cut his uses back more and more and more, he's averaging a career high turnover percentage by about 7%. So he's turned the ball over way more than he ever has, despite JB dialing back his usage. I think that's probably what's been the other thing, is that you're not getting the defense, and then also what you thought was special about him, he's not doing as much now, and now it's hurting the rest of the lineup as well because you don't get enough playmaking. So I feel bad at some points for Duren, but I feel like his struggles are being like kind of put on, kind of put on front page because of the other weaknesses on the roster as well. So is there anything else you want to hit on with the starting lineup before we move on?
No, we can move on. I would just say I think the thing with JD is he's a guy that just turned 21, and that kind of goes to what I was saying earlier. But you find that line of at what point do you maybe curtail opportunities and just prioritize, let's get players on the floor who can execute and help us chase that goal. And maybe that's something you don't talk about as much around game 25, but around game 35, 45, you get closer to the deadline and you're making bigger organizational decisions. That's probably something you include in that, right? Like if he's not that guy right now, then is that something we need to go out and get at some point? And there's a broader discussion with Jalen Duren. I think with the extension coming up next summer, that they have some decisions I think that are going to become pretty pressing here, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we'll get into that in the third segment when we talk about this
Mhm.
upcoming trade market. So stay tuned for all of that. But when we come back, I want to discuss what Omari brought up when ways that the Pistons can try to help Cade and kind of take some of the pressure off of him. We'll discuss that coming up. With big wireless providers, what you see is never what you get. Somewhere between the store and the first month's bill, the price you thought you were paying magically skyrockets. With Mint Mobile, you'll never have to worry about gotchas ever again. When Mint Mobile says $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, they mean it. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at 15 bucks a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for 15 bucks a month. To get this new customer offer, you need your new 3-month wireless plan for just 15 bucks a month. Go to mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. That's mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. Cut your wireless bill to 15 bucks a month at mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for more details. Head over to mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free to available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And like I mentioned earlier, head over to lockedondaily.com. Type in your email and you'll get a Locked On Pistons daily newsletter with your Locked On Pistons daily podcast. So, Omari, I think a lot of people, I think most people would agree that Cade is taking another step this year. He's improved. He looks a lot better this year. He's shooting 37, almost 38% from deep. He's been more engaged defensively. He's averaging career highs across the board: points per game, assists per game, rebounds, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage. He's tying his career high right now in 2-point percentage, career high efficiency field goal percentage. Everything besides the free throw shooting, which is really bugging me. I don't know why through 3 years shooting 85% from the free throw line, and all of a sudden he's shooting 78. That can't continue to happen. But he's taking a step forward. But a lot of the discussion I've seen in the Pistons community has been his turnovers, his turnovers, his turnovers, his turnovers. And while he is towards the top of the league, I believe last I checked, he's third in the league, fourth in the league in assists. Um, he also is one of 5 players that have 4 triple doubles already this season. despite that, he is turning the ball over a little too much. That is true. And there's been a lot of talk about how can you limit his turnovers? How can you help Cade? Should they be taking the ball out of his hands? Who should be taking the ball out of his hands? How can you get him off ball a little bit more? Maybe give him some cleaner looks on some catch and shoot opportunities, run him off some screens, or just how to make the game a little easier on him to where the defense isn't all just keyed in on him and you don't have these turnovers maybe happening as much. Is there, I mean, you mentioned it earlier. Do you think there even is a solution on the current roster to mask that until you get a bigger answer? Or do you think it's kind of, this is just what you got with this roster? You're going to have to deal with it until you make a move.
Yeah. So what we're 24, 25 games into the season, and the turnovers. I think he's cut them down, Cade, in the last month or so after a rougher start. But it's the second year in a row that we're seeing him come out the gate with that turnover issue. And I mentioned it earlier, but you look at the way that this roster is structured, and it's essentially structured for Ivy, Sasser, and potentially Asar to be the guys, or Duren, who are maybe uh, the release valves for Cade, if you want to put it that way. Guys who can take some of that load off of his plate, push the ball in transition, maybe get him some easy spot up opportunities or cuts here and there, and that hasn't quite materialized. You mentioned, but there are other guys on the team who are turning the ball over at high rates. I don't even think Cade has the highest turnover rate on the team. It's just more so. It's a few things there, right? One, he has the ball by far the most of anybody on the roster, so his turnover opportunities are going to be just much higher just off of that. He's also never passed the ball better than he has right now. If you look at the assist numbers and just overall passing efficiency, so I think you have to look at both of those things there. But also teams are, defensively blitzing him, with little downside because there's nobody else on the roster who can consistently punish them for doing that. And then Kate just has some sloppy ones here and there too, right? Maybe he's, just being pressured up the floor and he just bounces it off his foot, or you have plays or he jumps and there's no plan. Just stuff like that you could probably cut out a turnover or two a night just off of those. So there's a few things going on at once, but I think the bottom line for Cade is that sometimes when he has those late turnovers, it's Cade's costing them opportunities to win because of the turnovers. And really more so the problem is that he's the only player who's gonna have the ball in those scenarios anyway. So, I think that creates a very predictable offense for the Pistons, and it's just easy to defend if you could just put two defenders on Cade at all times, knowing that every few possessions is going to be a turnover or almost turnover. So, maybe a SAR, JI, somebody on the roster takes that leap and becomes that second person. But, I think you're at the point now in the rebuild where Cade's in year 4. He already signed the extension. You have a better idea of his strengths and weaknesses and who he is. And even though he'll also continue to get better, especially this past week, you look at the Sixers, you look at the Bucks, those guys aren't relying on whether or not one guy turns the ball over. And I think that's the better discussion we have with the Pistons is that they have no other option if K is having that type of night. And when you're boxed in that way, it makes you easy to defend. It puts a lot of pressure on K to essentially be perfect. And just organizationally, you have to figure out a way to take pressure off of him. So if you're not developing that internally, you have to go out and get it in some capacity.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up with the question, but me and you kind of talked about this on Twitter. One of my
Yeah.
friends last year already said that like we're heading down like the Stafford arc, like we're
Mhm.
we're head, we're heading down the Matthew Stafford arc. Where I think everyone in Detroit knows how like the Stafford story arc went, but I just think it's funny that like my friend mentioned it last year, and now I'm seeing like, oh god, he might actually like this might actually be happening, but
Mhm.
we'll see if it actually goes down that road. But I do want to ask this, so. Denver in the postseason the last 2 years. They ran into, I believe, it was the Lakers in the conference finals who did it, and then I believe in the first round, I think it was Minnesota. Second round, Minnesota did it to them as well. They were really pressuring Jamal Murray from the get go, off the inbounds, pressuring him up the court, making it hard for him to get up the court, causing turnovers, making them get late in the shot clock to where they're now running late offense. The ball handler who's bringing it up the court is now so gassed that Jamal's not really able to do anything. They had that problem, and JJ Redick kind of hit on this in his podcast before he took over for the Lakers, but they did a really good adjustment. I think everyone saw it was they started having Aaron Gordon bring the ball up. They let Jamal Murray, he can run the offense, but in the half court. Let them get the ball past half court, and then they get the ball to Jamal Murray. Now they can run their action with Jokic and Jamal without having to worry about Jamal, his stamina hitting zero before you even get to the half court line. So the Nuggets, obviously, and other teams in the NBA have that option on the team to where, okay, if you're going to do that to our guy, we have someone else who's a trusted ball handler. We'll have them bring it up against the pressure just to get the offense set, so we don't have to have our main guy, gassed. And I really think that should be an option the Pistons need to consider. Let someone else bring the ball up, attack that pressure, and then you get the ball to Cade in the half court and let him run the sets. The problem is, like you mentioned, is there another player that you trust more than Cade to handle that pressure getting up past half court? I mean, you mentioned his usage rate is at a career high. He has the ball in his hands more than just about anybody. He's towards the top of the NBA. I don't know how many other players have this much on his plate. Is there another player on the roster that you think the Pistons can trust to get the ball into the half court setting?
I think the key to that question is more than Cade, and the answer is no. There are other players who could bring the ball up, and I think could do so with success. We see Ji push the ball when he has it, and obviously he's a viable option. He's probably got the second best handle on the team after Cade. I think Sasser is a guy who can handle the ball well enough to bring it up the court, and we've seen his minutes go up over the past few weeks once they had some injuries. And I think Asar, now that he's back, he could do that a little bit as well. But I think with those guys, you run into some of the same issues where, if you pressure Asar, it's his handle at the point now to where he's not going to turn that ball over, once or twice while he's being pressured. I think with Ji, uh, you know, I I don't know if you have that fear that he's going to turn the ball over before he gets to half court. It's just once you get past half court, like, how does the offense unfold at that point, right? And I think with Ji, still shooting the three pretty well. Uh, that probably makes him a release foul for Cade as well. He could just toss the ball off and then immediately go into some sort of action, and he's a threat all over the floor. As I'm talking out loud, I think Ji is the best qualified to do that, but I think he can't. It can't just be on Cade and Ji. You need somebody ideally who's, I think, as good as Cade or better than both of those guys, really, to handle that responsibility. Because otherwise, like as you mentioned, you can just hound Cade the entire possession, and by the time the offense actually starts, though, you have 17 seconds, and things are probably a bit more hurried than you want them to be.
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, you mentioned this in the first segment. The lack of playmaking on the roster is just like, I feel like with each passing game, it's just becoming more clear.
Mhm.
You mentioned Marcus Sasser. You see Sasser play so well in some situations, but most of those situations where he's like kind of playing the same role as Ivy, where he's playing off ball and he's just
Mhm.
utilizing his scoring. It truly is kind of like, a lot of the discussion when the Pistons drafted Asar, when they drafted Ivy, when they drafted Duren was, you know, do you have enough shooting? And a lot of the counter, arguments were, well, you're gonna have enough playmaking, you're gonna have enough decision making off a live dribble, and you guys gonna be able to, have the ball flowing one way to the other because of how high processing, the level of playmaking of these players. And now we're sitting here in 2024 saying the team just doesn't have enough trusted playmaking at this point. So I think, I mean, I'm sure that Trajan and JB believe that there's some level of an answer already on the roster with Asar coming back to full strength. I'm sure they believe there's probably a ceiling untapped for Duren that can eventually take up some of that. And I'm sure they also believe that JI can start doing that a little bit more and more and more as he improves. But look, like you mentioned earlier, you're reaching extension times. You're starting to get a little closer and deeper into the season. It's starting to become like broader discussions where you might need to start considering, other options. And that's where I want to go next. Unless, is there anything else you want to mention before we move on to the trade market?
No, no, we could go ahead and move on.
All right. So when we come back, I want to discuss the trade market with Omari and whether we should expect the Pistons to be active and potentially making any moves this season. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL app, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. I've told you guys this many a times. I started using FanDuel a few years ago. I still use it to this day. It's super fun, super easy to use, super self-explanatory, but obviously, most importantly, it's super fun to use. So head over to FanDuel.com and use $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Another great way to support the podcast. And also, again, head over to LockedOnDaily.com. Type in your email. You'll get a Locked On Pistons daily newsletter. Real quick, Omari, after reading that FanDuel ad, and mentioning the NFL, I just have to say real quickly, I have to give my thoughts on this because it's been killing me the last few days. I completely am in lockstep with Dan Campbell going for it on fourth down at the end of that game. Do not give the ball back to Jordan Love. Your offense, which one would you rather have? You rather win it with a half yard, win the game on a half yard, or risk giving the ball back to Jordan Love, kick a field goal, and then give it up to Chance with a 50-50 coin toss and risk never even getting the ball again and having your worst unit on the field back-to-back possessions. Absolutely not. Win it with a half a yard. I'm going that route every time.
No, I agree. I agree. I agree. And the thing is, when you have like the best offense in the league, like if you can't trust your offense to get a half yard, then whatever you've been doing,
Right.
and we've seen so many clutch fourth downs with this team that yeah, like every now and then there's gonna be one that Dan goes for, and you're like, do we really need to? But the answer is yes, because they work out enough as we saw on Thursday that yeah, like it's a half yard. Like, come on. I'm glad that Madden logic has become mainstream because I've
There
always
you go.
played this
Yep.
way. I've always played this way. It's like, why would I give him the ball back when I could just get a half yard? Like that always made sense in Madden, and I just feel very validated to see Dan Campbell do this without so much success. So I'm gonna say that as well.
That man logic coming true, man.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, for anyone out there, for some of you guys follow my Twitch, I do have a Madden tourney I'll be participating in later at 1 o'clock on Saturday. Oh, actually, you guys won't be listening to this on Saturday, so never mind. But some of you guys may have tuned in. Hopefully, I play well. I won my first professional game, Omari, last tourney.
Hey,
I was 0-3 heading into it, but I won my first one last tourney.
Hey.
Lost the second round, but it is what it is. That's okay. Let's move back into the trade market. All right, so you mentioned, Omari, obviously that they don't have a lot of playmaking. And obviously heading into this point of the year rebuild, like year 5, Cade's year 4 to sign his extension. At some point, maybe some people may not feel it's at this point, but at some point, eventually, you're going to have to prioritize actually building the best roster possible, trying to win as many games. Is that point right now? Maybe, maybe not. Is that the goal of Trajan right now? Does he really want to fork up that first round pick that will become, not theirs if they were to make the playoffs? Do they really want to do that? That's stuff has to all come into consideration. With that said, you mentioned earlier, J.I. is coming up on extension talks. Jalen Duren coming up on extension talks. I've believed all offseason that this trade deadline was the marker where he's going to make a decision. Trajan, that is. He's going to give everyone to the trade deadline around that time, and then based on what he's seen, he'll make a decision. That's why I've always felt. Do you feel that way? Do you think we may see some moves, or do you think that this may be a quiet time for the Pistons?
So I'm curious to see myself. I think with the deadline still a couple months away, just so much of that comes down to where the team is around the time of the deadline. But I think along with that, this deadline is arguably the first time that, or really is the first time that we'll get to see Trajan operate with sort of a broader plan in mind, right? And that's not to say he didn't have one this offseason, but you look at the timing of when he came in, and he essentially had like a week or two before the draft, and their strategy over the summer was clearly to augment what was already here and just add to it, right? Get some veteran shooters, fill some positional gaps, like add depth to the group. He inherited something that was already underway, and he added to it to just see what these guys could do in a more stable environment. And yeah, this upcoming trade deadline is the first time where we'll begin to see how he operates once he has a much firmer grasp of what this roster is, right? You come in and you just need data. You got to see how Cade handles scenarios. You got to see what Ji, and you got to wait for a star to come back, and then you got to see what he could do. And I think there's just this information gathering period that you have to have when you're a new front office inheriting something. He didn't come in with a sledgehammer. He came in and essentially kept what was already here going to some capacity. So I think we'll learn a lot, this trade deadline as far as how high or low he is with certain players, or his idea of what this roster needs to move forward. And I think a lot of that comes down to where the team is. If they're still at this, they've lost 5 of their last 7. If they're still on that pace in February, then maybe it's we have these vets on 1-year contracts, and they're not going to play for anything. So maybe we see what we have there. If you're winning games, maybe it's the opposite, right? Maybe it's, oh, we're the Indiana Pacers, and we need to go out and get our Pascal Siakam. I think there's a wide range of possibilities that they could enter February with. But again, it just comes down to how well or how poorly the team is playing leading up to that point.
What part of the roster do you think they should, if they were to be in the trade market? What part of the roster do you think is the part is the part of the roster they need to upgrade the most? You mentioned earlier a few, you want it was more of a broader discussion. We kind of left it to later. What part of the roster do you think they need to go upgrade and add to help Cade, to help, take this team to the next level? What part is that?
Yeah, so over the offseason, we saw them add mostly to the group of wings, and then you added Paul Reed as like an actual, legitimate, backup big with experience, which they also haven't really had. But I think you look at the backcourt now. You look at Cade, and by then you'll have 40, 50 games of data on, along with just the like what he's played. Like this is who he is as a playmaker, right? He's a guy that's going to get you 7 to 10 assists a night on average. Absolutely a guy that you want to have the ball. I think some of the Cade discussion you just see on social media kind of ignores the fact that Cade is like he should have the ball. Like there's no reason why they should take the ball out of his hands entirely. He's not a wing. I think he is a playmaker. But you need two. You need two in today's NBA. I think that's just the reality. Giannis had to put up 59 and beat the Pistons in overtime when they didn't have Dame. Dame comes back and it becomes a much different game, right? So that's what I'm looking at. I think honestly, it's the backcourt. It's can Ji become that type of guy who is, going to run the offense with Case off the floor and this and that. And if Ji is not that player, I still think he's somebody you could build around, just because of his rim pressure, and I think he's improved on defense and he shot the ball really well. It's not that type of discussion necessarily with Ji specifically, but you still have to go out and whether it's a guard or a wing or somebody. So I say backcourt, but really it's more so that specific role. You need another creator. Maybe it's a guy that is just a veteran point guard and he just brings the ball up the floor, or maybe it's somebody who's an actual engine in and of themselves. But you have to make Cade's life easier in some capacity, and we talked about it, but that's probably their number one roster defensive seed at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what Trajan is going to have to answer, I think he's going to answer. I think it's going to happen by the deadline. In whether they get the solution for it or whether they start showing what they are looking for by the deadline, I think you'll start to understand a little bit more by then. But I completely agree. I think what they need to figure out is wherever you stand on Cade, I think Cade can be a one. I think Cade can be an all NBA player consistently in the future. That's how high I am. But whether you think Cade is a one or two, I don't think is really the discussion at this point. I think they're sold on Cade. They gave him the contract. He's the guy they're building around. What they need to find out is Jaden Ivey a 2, 3, or 4? And if you don't believe he should be the, and this again, this is not a bad, like you mentioned, this is not more of a slight at Ivy. Ivy's had a
Mhm.
fine season. It's just a matter of, okay, should he be in that role, or should you take what he's doing and kind of put him in a different role and have someone else come in that can be a 2, that can be like the secondary guy, that can be that secondary creator. That doesn't mean you're moving off of Ivy. It doesn't mean, we're not suggesting trading Ivy. It's about getting someone else who can come in and create at the same level, or maybe even better than Kate. That's what they need to go get. I think it's a wing scorer, playmaker type of player. If Brandon Ingram didn't want a max contract, I'd be sitting here saying, go get him, go get him. But the max contract with his injury history is just, that's a tough sell. But a player like that is why I think you mentioned earlier, like Indiana's Pascal. Like they went out and got like Tyrese Halliburton's really good. They needed someone else who could also create on the same level as him. They needed somebody to go out there. Doesn't mean they didn't like Miles Turner Doesn't mean that they didn't like, name X play Benedict Mathurin. Doesn't mean name whatever player. It just means that they needed someone else to also create at the same level as Tyrese. And that's what the Pistons are at right now. They need to know, is Jaden Ivey that guy who's going to create the same level as Cade? I think J.I. has shown that he's been much better, and I think he has a role in the team moving forward. I'm skeptical of that. I think he can be probably your third scorer, your fourth guy, but you need to go get that second dude to really create at the same level as Cade. And I think that's what this team will be trying to attack, whether it's at the deadline or making moves at the deadline that will then free up and make it easier for them to do so in the offseason. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and I'm looking at Cade's numbers. Since he came, like he's shooting 37.8% from three right now. Like in his last 3 games since he came back from the injury, his shooting's picked up. He's given you 9 assists per game at this point. So if I have anything to add to that, I would just say it's time to move past the is Cade a point guard? Should Cade have the ball in his hands? This and that discussion. We have a guy who's producing like he does as a passer. He's clearly their best passer. Yeah, it's not really like I see so much of okay, it's not a point guard, this and that, and
It's
it's
so
just
frustrating.
it's like that's kind of outside the bounds of like how NBA teams operate now. Whether or not a guy is a point guard. I mean, uh what Boston, like how many point guards did they have the other night? But when you have Kristaps and Jalen Brown and a bunch of shooters and high IQ basketball players, a lot of that kind of takes care of itself, right? I think the bottom line for the Pistons, even if it's not necessarily a quote unquote playmaker, a lot of that's just like gravity too. Like it could be a guy who's, that type of playmaker, but even just somebody who is an above average playmaker for their position, but just has that scoring gravity, I
a
think probably
creator.
like a creator, right? Probably accomplishes a lot of the same things. You may be a wing or center who's only giving you 4 assists a night, but if they're taking care of the ball and defenses are still looking at them, I think that checks all of the same boxes as well. So we're still talking about number one, number two to Cade, I think, but I think the ball handling discussion is deeply tied to that as well.
I mean, we'll wrap it up here, but like,
Yeah.
you look at every team. Every team has like 3 or 4 ball handlers on the floor. Like Boston has
Mhm.
like 4 or 5 guys at all times on the court that can just handle, attack a closeout, make a read off a live dribble. Even like the heliocentric offenses that everyone goes back to. Luca and Kyrie operating at a high level. You got multiple guys that are on the floor creating like that. James
Yeah.
Harden and CP3 back in the day. Like it was never like the only time you ever saw like a real just one guy handling all the time was early James Harden Houston. And that was like what we're like almost 10 years ago now at that point. Like that's just
Yeah.
not how
He
the
also
NBA
had
is.
an absurd season. Like I still feel like that
Yeah.
season James Harden had doesn't get enough credit. Like he was, I mean, it was just an absurd season. That's a different combo, but yeah.
One of the best seasons ever. One of the best
Yeah.
scoring and playmaking seasons we've ever seen. Like so it's like that's just not how it goes. And you mentioned,
Yeah.
Cade shooting. I just want to say this before we wrap it up. Cade is in the 71st percentile on off the dribble jump shots. He's shooting 35.5% on pull up threes. That's all I'm gonna say. Okay, that's all I'm gonna say. He's also
Mhm.
he's also 71st percentile on catch and shoot threes. So that's all I'm gonna say. That's all I got to throw out there. I just had to make sure everyone knows that.
Yeah. He's not the problem, is what you're saying.
Yes, yes,
Yeah. Another thing too, I'll look at his last 8 games, like 5 of 10 for three, 9 threes, 7, 9, 6, 6, 9. Like his volume has gone up along with his efficiency as well. And we saw it last season, but we saw him start off a little cold in some ways and iron stuff out as the season went. And that goes into it too, is because we saw Cade get better as the year went last year. Like after the first 2 months, turnovers really were not an issue. Like his assist to turnover ratio was fine. Like not something you would ever consider to be part of the problem. So when you go into the trade deadline too, I think you also consider the fact that Cade could be a better player than he is right now. We saw it last season, and you look at his last few games since he came back, he's on the heater. That could very well answer this discussion too. But I think what we both agree on, bottom line, is that you know, as far as the Matt Stafford treatment that Cade's gotten, where he's the number one pick on a team that's not meeting the expectations you want them to beat, and I think naturally you're going to get that type of criticism. But I never felt like Stafford was the main issue, and I kind of feel the same way now. Where if you talk about issues on the team, there's bigger stuff you solve before you get to Cade, because we saw Stafford went to Los Angeles and he had no problems there, right? Like they had a team around him that could play to his strengths. So again, that's all a long way off, but I think Cade will continue to get better as the year goes on if he continues the trajectory he was on last season coming back from surgery.
No, yeah, the final story arc point that we have to get to. We haven't
Yeah.
gotten to this. We haven't gotten to this point yet. We need to get to the point where Cade takes a team that maybe should have won 15 games to 34 wins. People say he doesn't win enough, and then don't realize that without Cade, this team probably would be awful. He's
Yeah.
floor raising them, and we haven't reached that point yet. Kind of like 2017 Stafford, but is what it is. I have to wrap it up there. Appreciate you, Omari, for coming on, man. You guys can follow him over on Twitter at Omari Sankofa. You can shout out. You want to shout out your Blue Sky?
Yeah, I shot up my Blue Sky. I'm over Omari Sankofa over there as well. I'm just using X and Blue Sky right now. Maybe one day transition fully over to Blue Sky. That's we'll see how things go. But I'm active on Blue Sky. I put all my stuff. I live tweet. Like I'm treating that as a regular account. So if you're on Blue Sky or want to join Blue Sky, it's just my same name, first and last name. Give me a follow over there.
And then obviously you guys can also follow him and Bryce's podcast, The Pistons Pulse, on whatever podcast platform you guys found this one on. But I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Appreciate all of you guys. Enjoy the games. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Peace out.